Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Save time, save money, grow your business, and use your own desk and printer to make your home or office the post office with Stamps.com. I have personally had Stamps.com for probably, 5, 6 years now, maybe longer. I used it to ship autographed books out when they first released. I use it for business. I use it when I send out letters and gifts. A Stamps.com account takes just minutes to set up. There's no equipment to lease, no postage meters, no trips to the post office. You can print official U.S. postage for any letter, any package, any mail class using your own computer and printer. It's hugely convenient. It's really fast. And Stamps.com never closes. You too can experience the ease and convenience of Stamps.com with a special offer that includes a 4-week trial and a digital scale without long-term commitments. Just go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage and type in Seth Andrews. That's Stamps.com. Enter Seth Andrews. Stamps.com. Never go to the post office again. I'm going to try my very best to have a show for you next week. I'm running behind. I've just been doing so very much, and I'm starting to get overwhelmed. I just finished the Ark Encounter video, the kind of companion to this podcast. Matt and I are going to talk about a lot of different stuff. It's a longer form conversation, very different than the video which just released. It's called Atheists at the Ark Encounter. So I just put it together and released it to YouTube. I've got a James Randi interview on the horizon, an Annabelle Gurich interview on the horizon. I've got October looming, and I've got ghost stories coming up. I haven't even begun to prepare for this. Starting almost 4 years ago, I started writing a custom story for the very end of the broadcast. Like the last third of Ghost Stories has been something that I've written and produced myself. Well, every year, you try to raise the bar even higher. And before you know it, you become overwhelmed. Holy shit, what am I going to do this year? So I haven't even started. So I'd like to be able to take some time and focus and make sure that show is up to your expectations. But I'm going to do my best to do some kind of broadcast, even if it's a random sort of a potpourri, you call and pick the topic show next week. Just bear with me, be patient, check your podcast feed on Tuesday, the patrons on Monday, and I'll do my best to get something to you, okay? Bear with me. Real fast, I'm going to be in New York City. I get a chance to speak in the Big Apple for the first time ever. I'm very excited about that. That's going to be Thursday night, September the 28th, hosted by the New York City Atheists. And it's free and everybody's welcome. I'd love a chance to meet you. Details on everything at thethinkingatheist.com. On my September 1st tour of the Ark Encounter was Matt Dillahunty. He's a friend. He's one of the hosts of the Atheist Experience, and he hosts the Atheist Debates YouTube channel. He's kind enough to join me here so we can talk about some of the stuff we encountered at the Ark Encounter. Hey, Matt, it's good to have you. Thanks, man.
Absolutely. How are you?
I'm doing well. Been getting ready for Halloween, which is my favorite holiday of the year. Do you do Halloween in your house? Yeah,
actually, it's funny. So the day before Halloween, October 30th, is Beth's birthday. It's also our wedding anniversary. And while Christmas is certainly her favorite holiday, Halloween is a big deal. There's always a Halloween party. It's a Bertha versa Ween party, I think is what we've decided to call it.
In the house I lived in for the past 5.5 years, we didn't have any kids on the block, so there are no trick-or-treaters. So now that we just moved, and it looks like there's a lot of young families, I mean, there's going to be tons of activity. It's a great excuse to dress up the house. And so I've sort of, I've got the projections I'm going to stick in the windows, the ghost and the phantasms. I've got the fog machine in the front yard and the tombstones. And, I'm just a kid again. I'm having the time of my life.
There was a year or two when we were like in the apartment where we just didn't get any trick-or-treaters. And so it wasn't a lot of fun, although we did our, adulty party type thing. Now, yeah, I've got some outdoor lights and some spooky lights, and we get something new every year. And we're talking about if I ever get the garage emptied, which may never happen, but we might build like a put up and take down kind of mini haunted house thing, just some panels with black fabric and some scary stuff and some music playing in there. And then they would like walk in on the right side of the garage and do their little zigzag thing and come out the left side to get candy.
Who better to put together a Halloween thing than a magician, a guy who knows how to do illusion and pull off some of that stuff? I think that'd be a lot of fun.
It'll probably be 10 years before we get to it, but
yeah. Well, I wanted to have a conversation about the Ark Encounter. Again, I mentioned at the top of the show that I've already released like an 8-minute visual tour of the Ark featuring you and me. It's called Atheists at the Ark Encounter. It's linked in the description box. Obviously, it's very different than what we're doing today. This is kind of a companion conversation. The video is, by its very nature, a visual encapsulation of what the day was. But I wanted to, in a longer format, hang out with you and just kind of get your impression of the experience. We walk in, it's raining outside. The Ark itself already doesn't look like it's in amazing shape. I don't know if it's water damage on the outside of the Ark, but everyone's talking about this long line of discoloration on the exterior.
Yeah, it's kind of weird to me because there's clearly some staining. So it's like, did they just not use pressure-treated lumber at all? Or
you're in the parking lot. You're looking around, not a whole lot of traffic. You think the weather explains that?
There were actually a few more people than I thought, given the weather, or than I expected, given the weather. And then I was reminded that it was a holiday weekend, and a Friday for a holiday weekend. And so even with the weather, it turned out to be less than what I think should have been there. So yeah, it was kind of disappointing attendance-wise.
They've really hid the whole Ark Encounter exhibit, I don't know what else to call it, well off the road. I mean, there's no way to really see it. If you can't see it from the highway, they really make you buy the ticket and sort of take these little back roads back to see the attraction.
Yeah, that was I've never been to the Creation Museum there either. And I had no intention of going to the Ark Park, but this was, the Kentucky Free Thought Convention put this on and they paid for it because I don't want to give him any money, and I wish nobody was. But yeah, so there's the turnstile area there where they're clearly set up to queue hundreds, if not thousands of people. And there's zero people waiting in those queues. They've got this meandering line on the sidewalk, does a zigzag thing on the outside. That's empty. That leads to a queuing section that is empty, which leads to a double ramp to get up in there, which was also empty.
It's $10 to park, and then it's $40 a ticket for general admission. They have some discounts for seniors and whatnot. $40 pretty much ahead, right? It was 40, 43? Is that what you saw?
Yeah, I think it was 43 on my ticket.
Okay. So compared to other attractions, I mean, this is a pretty steep ticket for what you get. I wonder if the ticket price is part of the reason people are blanching a little bit.
I would think so. I mean, I find it ridiculous. So, I don't remember exactly. Beth and I have season passes to Schlitterbahn, the water park in New Braunfels, Texas. And this was the first year we did that because we went there with my, niece and nephew and my brother and his wife. And when we got done with our one-day pass, we had a bunch of fun. There was tons of stuff to do. We didn't get to do everything. And they made an announcement that says, hey, you can get a 2018 season pass right now by taking the ticket, and we'll apply the full purchase price of today's ticket to it. So we spent the whole day there with the two of us. I think it was, certainly it was more expensive than $40, but we got to apply that entirely to a season pass, which is not just for 2018. It covered all the rest of 2017 as well. So it's like a couple $100 and we go as often as we want. And, if you tell me that this attraction is going to be $43, before I even got inside there, I already thought it was paying way too much. I kind of had this expectation that this is, like me go a $15 to $20 sort of thing. And when I got in there, I wouldn't give them $5.
Oh, you were that disappointed with it? I mean, beyond the selling of the Genesis narrative, I mean the actual structure itself. For you, it wasn't worth $5.
By the time I got through and saw, I think we were in there for an hour and a half, couple hours, but inside of 20, 30 minutes, it became very clear that this place is just empty, not just the parking lot. Like the structure itself, there's some boxes with, nothing in it. And then there's some boxes with some fake animals and fictional stuff, which I'm sure we'll get to. But by and large, the entire structure on the inside just felt empty because for me, the majority of the displays, there were some, don't get me wrong, there were some nice displays there with, animals and people and other stuff. But most of the displays looked like they took a page out of the children's creationism book and turned it into a 3 or 4 foot placard that they stuck on a wall. That's what most of the displays were.
They compensate for the lack of animals with sound effects. And they show like a bunch of crates, closed door crates, presumably animals, birds, rabbits, anacondas, whatever's in there. And so obviously the crates are just facades. And so they compensate with sound effects or speakers placed in strategic places all around the Ark. You hear the sound of the waves crashing against the bow, an attempt at a sensory experience. But I looked at the crates and actually my first thought was animal cruelty, right? Like we turn people into the Humane Society for placing animals in these small cages with the barest of necessities for any length of time.
I've got a good picture of you right when we walked around the first bend. Well, it's not a good picture, but it's a picture. And your head is right there. And the bins, the first thing I think of, because of the way they've positioned like the opening handle and everything, they look like microwaves. Like these are microwave-sized containers all along there to stuff animals in.
They've got the apparatus for food and water to be delivered en masse. I mean, they've got like some contraption pipes coming down the side, I guess, directing rainwater. He's got a system for almost everything. Did you see the Uber bathroom, like the Uber animal toilet or whatever that thing's supposed to be?
Yeah, I'll give him credit that as I walked along, there were questions that popped up into my head. I'm analytical. I worked, finding problems in software. I find problems in logical arguments now. And so as I walk along there, I'm like, well, how do you solve this problem? How do you solve this problem? And I will give them credit that there has been a lot of thought put into this about potential ways to solve these problems. I'm sure that when they come across a problem that they can't come up with a practical, scientific sort of solution, well, it's just, God made the animals comfortable in those tiny places, or God made them sleep and not poop or whatever. But there was some cool stuff where they had done some thought. Then they tried to answer every objection that somebody could come up with. But it all started going downhill for me the second I got onto the tram to even ride out to the Ark, because there was a voice narration from Ken Ham about how awesome the Ark Park was. And at one point he said, the trees that we used for the lumber have been dated to be 200 years old. And immediately I'm thinking, okay, so you're okay with dating methods, provided they show that the lumber you used to build your mock-up Ark at 200 years, but those same dating methods align up with all the other dating methods that show a much older Earth than you're willing to advocate. It was cherry picking from the second I got on the tram.
They also had an exhibit with old Bibles dating back as far as, I guess, the 1600s, specific dates noted on the exhibits. This Bible is this old, and this Bible is this old, and so on and so on. Yeah,
I'm looking through the pictures as we talk about it, because, obviously the pictures are taken in the order that we saw things. Lots of placards, some attempting to answer questions like, have 99% of all species gone extinct? And they're very careful about using the word kinds instead of species whenever they're providing their explanations. And so, they've got the pictures of Noah bringing animals on the Ark that are now extinct, and, that's all dinosaurs. And then there's some kinds, the Caseid kind, the Periosaur kind, and they use these as here's kind of an umbrella type of dinosaur or ancient mammal that we're going to lump everything under. So they had the deer kind, the dog kind, the cat kind. And it really gets back to this point that we've talked about before. There's almost nothing here that we wouldn't probably find at the Creation Museum, I'm assuming. But for people who are denying the fundamental facts of evolution in favor of their creation model, they're actually arguing for a far more rapid evolution, that in the span of a very, very short period of time, the dog kind, was able to become everything that we would find that we'd now label a dog.
He'd sort of backed himself into an evolutionary corner, so to speak, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big chart that shows, he's got 1,398 animal kinds, And because there are, pairs, and then there's 7 pairs of, clean and blah, 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 that ends up being 6,744 animals. And there's this whole big wall there, and it just says everything fits, and it shows displays of the Ark. And they're saying, we've essentially figured out every kind of animal that would need to be on the Ark, and we can show that we can fit them all in this space. Except that what they're picking out as kinds doesn't even come close to representing what we would identify as independent species, being incapable of crossbreeding at the time frame that the Ark thing supposedly occurred. Everything is viewed through the lens of it must be a young Earth, and so we're going to ignore these aspects of science when it's inconvenient for our tale, but we'll grasp onto chunks of those science when we can make it fit. He's selling his non-science as if it were science. But, you walk through this, and there's sort of this commentary on the Genesis tale. A good chunk of it doesn't have all that much to do with Noah's Ark. But one of the first things that I remember just staring at in awe is there's, just before the diorama that you and I know both want to talk about, there is this wall that is labeled Descent into Darkness. And there are these big kind of 6 foot by 2.5 foot, whatever, pictures, for lack of a better word. And each one of them has a word at the top and a Bible verse. And these are the things that supposedly led to the descent into darkness. And it starts off with civilization. I don't understand how that's a negative under any context, but civilization led to the descent into darkness, as did polygamy, as did music and metalworking and giants. Yeah, giants there in all seriousness, just as if it was as real as metalworking.
It's almost like the Tower of Babel. If we become too much, we are attempting to replace the mind of God. We shouldn't be too smart. We should just surrender.
Yeah, and I mean, I didn't go there expecting an unbiased, scientifically accurate view of the world. I expected pretty much what I got. Right after the descent into darkness, there's this big banner, which was, I took a picture of it because it just says, "Imagine a godless world." And I was like, yeah, cool. But right underneath the words "imagine a godless world," it says, "full of sorrow, full of disease, full of bloodshed, full of death." And I'm like, actually, the biblical world, as described in the Bible, is full of sorrow and disease and bloodshed and death. Everything about it it's like you stepped into Bizarro land. They talk about, hey, we're looking at the same facts, but we're looking at them through 2 different worldviews. There's the scientific secular worldview, and then there's the biblical worldview. And I agree that for the most part, we're looking at the same facts. Sometimes they'll just flatly ignore the facts when even through their own worldview, they don't make sense. But it's not about a worldview coloring the facts. It's about which interpretation of the facts actually leads to a worldview that is reasonable and best supported, that involves the least amount of cherry picking and all this other stuff. So they want to make it seem like, hey, you've got your worldview, I've got my worldview. And when we look at these facts, of course, we're going to come to different answers. And that explains it all because I have my biblical worldview and blah, blah, blah. But it's not as if those worldviews or those glasses that we're viewing the evidence through are remotely equivalent to whether or not they're supported by evidence or whether they're reasonable or true.
You mentioned bloodshed. Let's talk about the diorama. Let's talk about this. It's an awesome display. It's actually well constructed, for lack of a better word. I mean, the artists are obviously talented people, but it's just so bizarre. And there is a shot of this in the short video that I'm releasing. When it goes out, I'll include a link in the description box, or just look for it on YouTube. It's Atheists at the Ark Encounter. But if you were to stand in front of almost anyone and describe what Ken Ham is apparently selling as this probably happened, they would think you were out of your mind. Set it up. Describe what you saw.
I felt like I was at my local comic book shop viewing a fantasy diorama put together by some fellow geeks who were going to be playing in this environment. There's a pit with a bunch of people in there. There's a dude, looks like he's getting ready to push a spear through a woman. And there's some other people groveling around. It's kind of, I tend to avoid trailers, but I've seen the Thor Ragnarok trailer. And so the arena thing that is in the Thor Ragnarok trailer is essentially this, except what's coming out of there. Or you can think Star Wars when Jabba drops Luke down in the pit.
Yeah.
what's coming out of the doors is a creature. It's a dinosaur with weird, like gold-plated horns, and it's like, I don't know, is it a mutant T-Rex because it's got spikes on the side? It's beautiful, and it would be a really good scene from any fantasy movie. And yet for Ken to portray this as if this is not fantasy just boggles my mind.
The idea is that back in the day when we were wicked, before we drowned and then became wicked again, I guess, we didn't just feed each other to the lions. We fed each other to some ornate dinosaur, which apparently they had trained enough to get it back into its cage for the next round. I mean, it just makes no sense. And yet I look at it and I think either he's just blatantly and unabashedly marketing to imaginative children, trying to capture their imaginations with all this stuff, or he's just out of his mind. I have no idea what makes this man tick, or how he could conscionably, even believing the book of Genesis, put this in the Ark Encounter. I can't reconcile it.
You know, and I mentioned that the horns had like ornate gold covers over the horns. This thing was cool. It was the coolest part of the whole museum, because if you took that out of, like, when the Ark Museum goes bankrupt, that's a diorama that should show up in, you know, fantasy shops and stuff as a collector's item. Most of the other stuff there was, you know, I don't see much use for it, but this would be cool. I could see a bunch of geeks like me sitting around a table, rolling those dangerous devil dice from AD&D, and having a combat in that arena.
I posted the photo on Facebook and I put the caption up. This is when Perseus raises Medusa's head to defeat the Kraken. Because, I mean, that's kind of the vibe that I got. It had very much a Clash of the Titans kind of a vibe about it. But, you know, he's got another one where they're doing baby sacrifice. And, you know, even the Creation Museum, if you're not missing much, but they've got a whole section that talks about the godless world. And we are at fault for everything. I mean, everything from the reason we have to bolt our doors at night to Hitler's Germany to weeds in the garden. They have an exhibit showing us having to till and remove the weeds. And there's actually an exhibit that says that we are responsible. Our sin is responsible for the fact that we now have to weed when we cultivate and harvest food. And I can't, I mean, it's a straight up Calvinism.
Yeah, it's, like I said, it wasn't anything that was particularly surprising. I think that there are plenty of people who haven't spent as much time as fundamentalists or with fundamentalists to kind of predict this. The dinosaurs only barely caught me by surprise. The diorama we talked about caught me by surprise, but a lot of the doctrinal stuff didn't, because it's the same thing that we've been hearing forever. And it's why one of my biggest complaints was that most of the displays were just slick graphics on boards stuck to empty walls that you could walk through. They could have saved a bunch of money and just produced a really high quality coffee table book, and you would have gotten all the same information and most of the same feel.
Can you spell out, I've heard you mention this from the stage a few times. Let's talk about evil humankind in relation to the God who created us. You use kind of a Sims scenario to talk about who's really responsible if we make mistakes, if we fall, if we fail. Can you kind of encapsulate that and sort of flesh it out?
Yeah, so this gets to a couple of different issues, which is, do we have free will? This comes up all the time in these discussions, because most versions of Christianity, apart from Calvinistic views, have a sort of libertarian view of free will. It's something that we know is not true. And the whole thing we're trying to do is figure out, where does the responsibility lie? So if there's a God who creates the universe, knowing how it's going to turn out, knowing the decisions that are going to be made, and this God could have created another universe, then it explicitly puts that God as solely responsible for everything that was going to happen. It's like, I wrote a script. I could have written a different script, but I wrote this one. I know what's going to happen. There's nothing that can surprise me. So what you have is the illusion of decisions, because they are already, it's not like God told you what to do. It's just that God picked the universe in which you would do this. And so when you get to the Garden of Eden story, first of all, I find it just asinine. We know better, just from people around us having children, that if you put children here and say, hey, don't touch that, they're they're going to touch that. And it's worse for the Garden of Eden story because you have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the very tree where upon eating it, you would then have access to know whether or not what you're doing is correct or moral or incorrect and immoral. And so you have a God who puts his creation down there. They don't have the knowledge of right and wrong, essentially, and then says, hey, don't touch that tree. Don't eat of that one. You can eat anything else, but don't eat that one. And when they do, which is an absolutely predictable occurrence, especially for God who's supposed to know everything, he is seemingly surprised and punishes them for doing the thing that they didn't have any good reason to think they shouldn't do, other than, just I said not to. They wouldn't even understood that you telling me not to do this and me doing it anyway is a bad thing. They couldn't have known that. And so they want to put all the blame on the woman, but at least on human beings for the fall, our departure from God. But yet God, according to their model, created us without a sufficient understanding of why we should seek to have a relationship with God, why we should seek to obey God, why we shouldn't disobey God. It's strange to me that this isn't like immediately obvious and renders the rest of the story fantasy, because every single person, or almost every person I've met, is wiser than the God of the Old Testament. Fundamentally understands that how could you possibly, we treat our children better than that. We know children have to be taught that they don't just come preloaded with the understanding of right and wrong. They don't, which is why parents seem to lose their minds repeating themselves over and over and over again. But no parent would say, hey, there's a loaded gun over there in the corner. Don't touch it. To a child who doesn't understand what a loaded gun is, doesn't understand the consequences of it, isn't really, sure about right and wrong, and yet also build a torture chamber in the basement for when they touch the gun, they take them down there and torture them. It is, you made allusion to this Sims thing. If I'm creating a computer game and I put a bunch of simulated people in there, if they're unable to understand my instructions to them, that must be my fault. It cannot be their fault. I created them. I don't have to create them with the same level of knowledge that I do. But if I create them and they're unable to understand my instructions to them, that is necessarily my fault. Now, if I create them capable of understanding my instructions and then they go off and do their own thing, okay, now we've got free will and some responsibility there. But if I'm the creator, I don't get to blame. It's like the craftsman who blames his tools, instead of himself for how he goes about using them.
Now we have to get into the whole idea of inherited guilt or inherited responsibility. Your great ancestor did something untoward or wrong, and now you must be punished. The sin to the father kind of thing.
There's conflicts in the Bible, by the way, about how that's stated. Is it to the 4th generation or the 10th generation? And there's some verses that suggest it's not, even though it is. But at the end of the day, as a secular humanist, certainly I look at that and say that's absurd and immoral. You don't have to go back countless generations. If your dad did something that wronged my family, you're not responsible for that. You shouldn't be responsible for that. We can have separate discussions about how that may have benefited you and whether, reparations are due, whether there's sort of family lineage of responsibility in order to try to establish justice. But I don't get to imprison you for your dad being a bank robber. And yet this is the foundation upon which Christianity rests, that sin entered the world by people and it's passed down and nobody's blameless. Everybody's got sin. And this is the way they get around it, by saying, okay, it's not so much that your ancient ancestors did something wrong. You've done things wrong too. What they did was allow sin to come into the world, but you're participating in it too. You're just as much a sinner. So you're not really being punished for somebody else's sins, except that the catalyst for all of this, the thing that within Christianity brought sin and death into the world, is the disobedience against God, which we already talked about how absurd that is. And it poisons everything all the way down the road. Now, you're going to be held, according to Christianity, you'll be held accountable for your own actions. But you're guilty from the outset. You were born bad from the outset. And I loved that recently somebody expressed to me, when I was growing up, I viewed it all in a positive light. God loves you. He wants to save you. You know, Adam and Eve screwed up and you're a sinner and this is not God's fault. It's man's fault. And God just wants to save you. And somebody came up and said, you know, with the exact same facts, I spent my entire life with one thought rattling around in my brain. And that is, I've either done something or will do something that is so bad that Almighty God had to kill himself to make up for it. And that frames the entire thing in a way where they're carrying just this massive burden around. And these are generally good people that we, you know, it's not like they killed anybody or haven't stolen anything or done anything significantly wrong. They are imbued with this guilt from the beginning of their ability to comprehend, which is why, you know, I don't necessarily call it all child abuse and say it's all equal. But it is abusive to take young children and poison their mind to make them think that they are born bad. And now you spend the rest of your life knowing that nothing you ever do can be good enough. And you have to give yourself over to God. This is your one and only escape. We were watching a documentary on false confessions and the techniques that are used to get confessions, which may or may not be true or false, are very similar to the manipulating methods used by religions to get people to say, you know, hey, you don't want to go to hell, do you? You better just go ahead and accept Jesus. You better say this is true, even if you don't believe it's true.
It's almost an abuser-abusee relationship. You know, it's when you hear people talk about an angry and jealous God, it's almost like the battered partner. You know, oh, trust me, if you could see him on his good days, he really is a loving person.
He threatens me with hell because he loves me.
Yeah, it's for my own good. I'm really not. He's the smart one, and I overstepped, and I provoked him, and it was really my fault. And you know, you hear these sort of excuses. You do get that battered partner vibe, and I haven't had much luck with that analogy while speaking to religious people because they usually double down on the love verses and ignore the rest. You know, it's funny, when we were touring the Ark Encounter, you and I hit the third floor. I guess it was the third floor. I don't know. There's no easy way to get from level to level. Do you notice? I mean, they have these long ramps. And so in order to access each floor of the Ark, you have to essentially walk to the other end and back and forth.
Yeah, I know there's a couple spots where they have elevators, which
okay.
I mean, that was amusing. But by and large, it is a very linear tour. You go in, you do a lap around this floor, and then you follow the ramp up, and you do a lap around the next floor, and you follow the ramp up. By
the time I see you on the third floor, Matt Dillahunty, I'm thinking you're looking for the door. Yeah, I think you were done. You're like, yeah, been there, done that. There was nothing new under the sun. Were you just done? Were you just kind of fed up?
Yeah, I think so. For me, and the way I look at stuff, I am constantly in sort of debate mode. Let's figure out what's going on. This is stuff that I'd seen and heard before. But there were also some things there that caught me by surprise that were so boneheadedly confused and dishonest that it became clear just how big of a hurdle we have to overcome to get people to realize how much nonsense is involved in this. There was a picture that said, this is what a mountain covering local flood would look like. So they're arguing for the global flood. And they have a mountain, and the ark is floating many feet above the mountain. And then there's just like this straight line that comes right down the center of the mountain to where the water is a little lower level. And it's hard to describe, but it's pretty absurd. And that's their point. Oh, it couldn't possibly be a local flood because it would look this ridiculous. And the thing that bugged me was that it presumes that their story is accurate, that the water was this high over the highest mountain. That is a circular argument. We're going to begin by assuming that the Bible's description of the flood is correct. And then we're going to show how ridiculous it would be for anybody to try to claim that the Bible's description of flood could possibly be describing a local flood, when it could have started with local flooding stories and local flooding myths and then got expanded. And the ridiculous element comes from what was expanded in the Bible. I did like that when they started digging in on other issues, they had a plaque on ungodly prejudice. And it said, sadly, some professing Christians have misused passages of the Bible to spread racist ideas, such as slavery based on a person's skin tone, or the notion that interracial marriage is sinful. But what does the Bible actually teach on these matters? They ignore Exodus. They go from a couple passages in Genesis all the way up to Acts. But really, it was very careful wording because they can't argue that the Bible doesn't support slavery. It explicitly does. But they say Christians have misused passages to spread racist ideas such as slavery based on a person's skin tone. Well, skin tone wasn't the foundation for slavery, either in the Bible or otherwise. It was convenience that we were using this other group of people who's, had darker skin than us. But there's been all sorts of slavery where, the Bible talks about the Israelites being enslaved. So they can't say the Bible is opposed to slavery. All they can say is the Bible doesn't support the idea of enslaving people based on skin tone, and the Bible doesn't support the idea that interracial marriage is wrong. And yet the Bible had been used to support both of these things in the past. It's like they know the objections that people launch, and every time they're going to try to answer it, they just ignore the facts about reality and throw up a big red herring. Right next to that is a picture that says, which view is confirmed by history and archaeology, evolution or the Bible? And nowhere on that display does it attempt to actually answer the question it asks. It just says evolution is the popular view of our ancient ancestors has been strongly influenced by evolutionary teaching, which portrays early humans as unintelligent, grunting brutes. And the Bible reveals that man was created in the image of God. In the very beginning, he was highly intelligent, capable of remarkable achievements, except that what they're defining as the very beginning is much, 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 much later in the evolutionary time. So everything about this is, let's paint everything with the brush of our shit is true, and then make any objections to this look ridiculous because it conflicts with what we already believe. It's circular argument after circular argument all the way through this thing. It's
a knowing avoidance or recoloring of the most inconvenient parts of the Old Testament. And of course, this prompts the question, a natural question, which, as I often hear you say, because I can't read minds, I don't know the answer. But the question still appears. Is this somebody making a buck knowing it's a lie, or is this just straight up confirmation bias?
We talked about this before, with regard to others like Ray Comfort, where people are like, oh, they can't just be that stupid. So it must be either the world's greatest actor and liar. If Ken doesn't actually believe this stuff, then it's the best acting job ever, because watching him debate Bill Nye, you can watch how someone thinks. And in a live debate, unless you've worked it out ahead of time, you probably aren't able to prepare for potential surprises or what your opponent will say well enough to allow you to prepare the most ridiculous responses ahead of time. Now, I could be wrong here a little, because whenever Ken got in trouble during that debate, it was just, well, I've got a book. And so it could be a big fraud, but I would need evidence that this was a fraud, because clearly a lot of people believe and buy into what he's selling, what Kent Hovind is selling, what Ray Comfort is selling. It's still, there's still more believers. There are probably fewer of these young earth anti-evolutionist creationists than there are atheists and secularists. But there's enough people that I think it's more reasonable to say that they're just one of them, that these people are sincerely expressing what they sincerely, or maybe insincerely expressing what they sincerely believe, and they could just be wrong. I think that incompetence is a much more likely answer than intentional deception, but who knows?
While we're in the arena of conjecture, let's just spitball for a second. Do you think the Ark Encounter is going to survive over the course of 5-10 years if it's delivering nothing new? Right? If we're talking about the same stuff on the same tour at $40+ a head, what do you think? In practical terms, I expect it to go bankrupt. I think that the debate Bill Nye did was a mistake because it infused more money in there. Because Ken Ham gets to win no matter what the outcome is. Hey, we won this debate. We need more money to fight the evil evolutionists. Hey, we lost this debate. They're winning. We definitely need more money. Oh, wait, so if he'd invited you to debate at the Creation Museum, you would have not have accepted?
Correct. I was opposed to Bill doing it or anybody else doing it as well.
Is there, we'll come back to the original point. Is there a condition in which you would have said yeah?
If there was a way to guarantee that there was no way to make money from it, which as a practical matter, you just can't do, because when it's over, even if he did the whole debate for free, he still gets to go back to his, the people he's getting donations from and say, we need more money because we're losing, or we're winning. See how good we're doing. Give us more money. And while I would expect under normal circumstances for it to go to bankrupt and fairly soon, especially now that they're coming up in conflict with the state on their tax exempt status and other stuff. I suspect that because so much of it, they got the land dirt cheap and worked out all these deals and everything else, I think that there are enough wealthy, extremely confused theists, Christians in particular, that they'll keep that ark going for another 20 or 30 years at least, just because it's not about whether it ever makes money to them, to the people who are donating. It may be about whether it makes money to Ken, but the people who are donating, it's all about getting the message out. And the same reason I think Gideons are still giving out Bibles and putting them in every hotel room on the planet. The Ark Encounter will persist because there are people who are willing to donate massive amounts of money to keep it going.
Let's talk about the Ark story as a whole. People know you as one of the hosts of the Atheist Experience. They know you from Atheist Debates on YouTube. You have these conversations. If you're in a conversation with someone who's pitching the fact, the truth of the Ark, the Noah's flood of Genesis, what's your angle? How do you tackle Noah's flood? Is it the moral argument? Do you go after the logistics of the flood and flood geology? Just what do you do?
It's actually one that doesn't come up that much. In the 13 years that I've been doing the TV show, I don't recall more than maybe a handful of times that somebody tried to make the case that the biblical account of the Noah story should be taken literally. Most people that I run across, it doesn't matter. They're not going to have to be a literalist about it. So I don't have to dig in on the science elements. I probably would if I was debating, if Ken Ham and I sat down to debate, did the Noah's Ark story happen as Genesis describes? I'd probably have to dig in a little bit to show the various flaws. For me, if somebody came to me and said they literally believed this story, we'd have to have a conversation about why it is that they think it actually happened and how convinced are they that this is important, that it happened exactly the way it's described. Could it have been a local flood? And then one of the nice things is that it's not just other religions standing in opposition to this. There's a number of different Christian worldviews. And so even Answers in Genesis has a section about arguments they think Christians shouldn't use. It's just not broad enough. So it's not for me about, how many animals were on board? Or isn't it ridiculous to think that the entire earth was flooded? Because if you begin with, there's a God who can't do anything, well, then the flood story and the Ark story is not all that outrageous. I mean, if you can do anything, then yes, you can divide the world up into kinds and you can put animals to sleep and you can give instructions for one guy and his 3 sons to build this massive structure and solve all of the technical problems related to animal husbandry and shipbuilding. And, this is massive, but God's there to take care of everything. And so I'd rather take a step back and talk about why they're convinced that any of this stuff is true rather than whether they can find a way to rationalize it. I haven't actually had to dig in on the specifics of Noah's Ark maybe more than a handful of times. And it's because when I start asking questions, it's always about, okay, what part of this is true and why do you think it's true? And more important than the why is more important than the what, but more important than why do you believe it is, should someone else believe it for the same reasons you believe it? Should I be convinced for the same reasons you are? And that becomes a much more important discussion. Because if the answer is yes, cool, then we have to go through their reasons. But if the answer is no, now we get to point out that they seem to be in this state where they're accepting something for reasons that they don't think people should accept something.
You think there's security camera footage of us meandering around the Ark? Do you think we'll make the Ark Encounter Christmas party or something? They'll show it. Hey, September 1st, we had a couple of special guests. Yeah, I don't know. For some reason, I felt surveilled the whole time. I'm sure I was just being paranoid when you and I were walking from exhibit to exhibit. But
I'm pretty sure there's cameras and footage, and I would imagine if they look through it, they could find some really awful expressions on my face, like there was a terrible smell that I was putting up with, because I felt that way for a good chunk of it.
So one last anecdote before I let you go. We're standing there. You were actually taking a phone call a few steps away, and Michael Hensley is with us. Ed and Michael Hensley are friends, and they're very involved in sort of exposing the Ark Encounter and all the tax stuff that's been going on there. But she's wearing an Atheist T-shirt, I mean, loud and proud, and this gray-haired gentleman walks up, Ark Encounter name tag on, obviously an employee or volunteer. He's on staff. He walks up and he says, "Are you guys really atheists?" Michael looked at him and she said, "Oh, yes, we are." And he looked her dead in the eye and he said, well, every knee shall bow. And then he turned around and he walked off. And I guess that was the final word. I always enjoy when religious arguments boil down to just wait till you're dead. It just seems like the weakest presentation of a winning argument ever.
As if somebody would show up wearing a "This is what an American atheist" T-shirt looks like and not be an atheist. Are you guys really atheists? Yeah. Oh, well, you just wait till you're dead. If there was really a God, he wouldn't need anybody to defend him, but certainly not self-righteous, sanctimonious jackasses who just want to toss out their God's going to get you when you're dead thing and then walk off. I mean, that's not the way this is one thing that I've pointed out in email many times. And it really, really irks Christians because they know it's true. When somebody writes in and tells me something like that, or God, wait till you're dead, or every knee shall bow, and they're not doing anything that would remotely be persuasive, I tend to tell them, I was a better Christian than you when I was a believer, and I probably still am, because I understood that I had an obligation to witness to people, not to just go up and say, hey, you're going to get it when you're dead. It's bizarre to me that, well, not too bizarre. I mean, people think they're right, but they don't seem to share the same passion for, is what I believe true, and how can I convince somebody of it? I'm an atheist because I cared about whether my beliefs were true, and I cared about whether I could show that to other people. Most of the people that we run into, like the guy at the Ark Encounter, they're definitely convinced they're right. I just don't think they care about whether there's any way to demonstrate this and whether they're under any obligation to share it with other people in a way that would be convincing.
My friend and fellow activist, Matt Dillahunty. Again, the Atheists at the Ark Encounter video is already out. I have the link in the description box, or you can just YouTube search Atheists at the Ark Encounter. I encourage you to check out Matt Dillahunty's work at the Atheist Experience and Atheist Debates on YouTube. Matt, it's always a pleasure, man. Thanks for talking with us.
Thanks, bro.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.